CNT120, Chapter 1. The last section in here is about troubleshooting network problems, and they walk us through a kind of like a troubleshooting framework that is really helpful to recognize that is a good process to follow. So they show a flow chart here of working through to try to narrow down problems. This might be something that gets used. You kind of like that first call. Somebody calls in and you work through a flow chart of like, hey, have you tried this? Yes, it didn't work. Okay. Have you tried this? And this starts working them through and trying to narrow down what the problem actually is. They give us a big framework of here should be some troubleshooting steps we use, and we'll quick talk through these. First is trying to identify the actual problem. Here you have to gather information. And this is where you start listening to customer, client, whoever it happens to be, or employee in the company. Identify the problem. They might say things like the internet's broke, and I say that half jokingly, but that's the kind of thing some people say. It's like, well, the internet's not actually broke, but I have to understand what they mean by that. Well, they might mean I cannot actually get out to the internet, or they might actually mean, well, I can't print something. So you might have to start asking some questions and listening to identify what is it that's not actually working. So you start off with like, okay, what is not working? Maybe what's different, what has changed, what worked yesterday and what's not working now, that kind of thing. You got to gather that information, and you might be asking questions and then being quiet and listening to understand what they're saying. From that, you try to go, okay, what might be the cause? What might be the cause here? And you actually start questioning some of the basics. It might sound like, annoying. Have you tried, making sure it's plugged in? Have you tried restarting it? Those kind of basic things to rule out some of the obvious stuff. You keep going. You're like, okay, maybe it is their computer. It just needs a good reboot so it picks up an IP address. Why don't we try this and see if it had? Did that work? Did that happen to be the problem? And you might keep trying a couple things to see if you can narrow down that either that fixed it or no, and that ruled that out, no, that ruled that out, no, that ruled that out. And you might be able to land on it, or you might get to a point where like, well, I've tried, the 5 or 6 obvious things. I might need to escalate this to somebody that knows more about this computer, this system, this part of the network, etc. So then you keep going until you try to find the problem, and then you start coming up with an action plan. What might we do to fix this? And it might be as simple as, a software patch, or, restarting a computer, or maybe even replacing a piece of hardware in the computer. Maybe the RAM needs to be, taken out, the slot blown out with air and reseat, those kind of things. You come up with an action plan, and then you try to implement, or again, escalate if need be. And once it implements, you go try everything. You go, did we actually fix the problem? Are you able to now print or browse the internet or whatever it happens to be? Once you verify full functionality, everything's working the way it should, you might need to do updates or anything to make sure things are going to stay that way, or maybe get the word out and do preventative updates on other things, that kind of thing. Last but not least, you want to document your findings and basically close out maybe that trouble ticket, if you will. That's a part that you end up doing in companies and places you work. You might actually have a trouble ticket system that you receive, and then you basically type into it and keep track of, and then when you're done, indicate it's completed, and that goes into a database. And now you have that information to look at for future problems. And that's where they mention here, this is kind of a flow chart you would follow to work through and start narrowing down what the issue is. In our networking classes, our networking labs, I tend to have students work from layer 1 to layer 7. It's just kind of a generic way to work at it. Check your cables, then check your ports, then check your IPs, and you kind of work your way up through the layers and check some of the basic, easy, obvious stuff and work your way to the harder stuff. That's what I have our guys in the lab room think about doing. That way they can hopefully rule out the easy stuff before it gets to be the harder stuff. So there's kind of like introduction on troubleshooting. Matching these layers is good. That is kind of the thing that they'll most likely have you do in certification exams down the road.